Welcome back to the channel, folks, and to a tutorial on how to paint the classic Barkmann's box set. And there's a lot going on in this box set, a lot of things you need to be able to do, so even if you don't have this particular set, it's still a good tutorial on how to paint your Panther, how to do the camo, all the washing, highlighting and such likes, as well as decals and the crew. And it's a great opportunity to have a look at one of the old classic sets that you're not going to be able to buy anymore. So folks, let's get started. Let's get started by airbrushing on the camo to the Opal Blitz and the Panther. If you don't have an airbrush, you can still get a camoed look. I recommend that you don't paint small lines, but rather paint in hard edge blotches, which was quite a common feature on World War II German vehicles. Airbrushing thin lines, as I'm doing here on a very small object, can be very challenging. You know, you've got to get the paint at the right consistency, the air pressure at the right consistency, but I'm not going to try and cover that in any great detail here, folks. This is more just about the look that we're after rather than the precise techniques, or it would be a hell of a long video. Now on the Panther, instead of painting thin lines, I'm going to paint blotches, and that's going to match the camo that's on the box art for the Barkmann set. But when applying multiple camo colours, the most important thing is to remember balance between all of those colours. So here I've started with Tamiya Dark Yellow 2, and then I've moved on to the blotches or stripes using Tamiya Red Brown. So after I've applied that red brown, I still have to apply the next colour, which is going to be NATO green, and after having applied that, still see the dark yellow as, in this style, the dominant colour. So these are the challenges that are going to affect us when we're planning our blotches in their size and in their placement. For me, the key to getting it right is at this stage here, when we're applying the first camo blotch. If we get the right sizes of those blotches and get them in the right places, then we can be confident when we put similar sized green blotches on that it's still going to look dark yellow with a 2 camo coverage. Now take extra care on the turret. If you're doing lines or blotches, it's very easy on that smaller area to totally overdo it, so that you just see the camo colours and hardly any of the dark yellow, especially on the top surface. And the best approach is often to get your general shape, especially when you're painting blotches, and then go back in and firm that camo up. Don't try to do too much in one pass. Take things one step at a time. Here you can see me starting to add the thin green lines to the Opal Blitz. Now you can see there's a lot of paint going on there, but it still looks basically dark yellow with camo lines on it. It takes a degree of experience to build up the muscle memory to apply the lines in a nice squiggly pattern, because you're going to be moving it over a very, very small area. You're not going to have a lot of area in which to turn the nozzle and keep it moving, so you need to build up a bit of experience and practice with that. Here I'm starting to add the green blotches to the Panther. You can see that they are the same sort of size as the brown, but even after they're applied, we've still got a nice dominant dark yellow finish. So we're going to apply this in the same way over the surface as we did with the brown. Now I should say, folks, that whilst we can get some really good results from an airbrush, it's not a walk in the park using it. It's not a bed of roses. It's something that you're going to have to build up practice and experience with. It's unlikely that you're going to pick it up and then start getting the kind of results that you're maybe seeing in tutorials such as this one. And even after you've mastered it, you might find you still have days where it just doesn't want to work. It just isn't going to go right. It may be that you get clogging, it may be that the airbrush itself just doesn't seem to be working the way it was the day before, and once again, that's just experience, folks. You'll know when you need to clean the airbrush adjust the mix, adjust the air pressure. So very much recommend that you try it if it's something that you're interested in, but very much also recommend that you are ready for a long journey of learning and ultimately satisfaction. After the fun of the airbrushing, we have the chore of painting tracks and wheels. Now, I'm not going to go into this in great detail, folks. All I'll say is that I start by giving the tracks a base colour of US olive drab. It's a nice dark brown, grey, earthy kind of colour, which I then will dry brush with some metallics. For the rubber tyres on the road wheels, I use dark rubber, though other dark greys are suitable. I tend not to use black. But as I said, I'm not going to go into this in too much detail. There is a dedicated tutorial for this in the Flames of War Vehicles Essentials playlist if you want to check that out. But once the tracks and running gear are done, I'm going to give the whole thing a nice gentle coat of gloss varnish. Not going to hit it too hard except on the tracks because they're metal on this kit, folks, and they need a bit of protection or they might chip. Now for the pin wash, I'm going to be using an acrylic product here from MIG Ammo. I'm not going to be using an enamel product. That is a suitable alternative to this acrylic, but this acrylic for me wins it every time because it is very quick to work with, dries quick, and there is no danger of any kind of odours. So you can see I put some out onto a palette. It comes out quite thick from the bottle for the pin wash itself, so we've got to thin it down a little. So add a little bit of water, as you can see me doing there. Then I'm going to add the wash to the water until I've got the right consistency. And as you can see, folks, it really is thin. It's very watery. So let's get started with the wash. Now, first thing to point out is the gloss varnish has been applied here at this stage mainly to allow the wash the best possible capillary action. By that I mean when we touch it to any kind of recesses or around raised features, the thinned paint will flow around that feature. The gloss varnish will also allow us to more easily remove any excess wash. Now, pin washes should not result in a great deal of excess wash on the surface. The idea being that the less wash that we need to clean up, the brighter the finish will ultimately be. So a careful pin wash will in many cases allow you to wash the thin panel lines and everything in just one single pass. But if we need to tidy up, the gloss varnish surface will allow us just to brush off the excess paint with a damp brush. Sometimes I remove it using a bit of a tissue paper as well, just to draw that off the brush. Sometimes I just draw the paint back into the panel line, just whatever works for that particular moment. Now this can feel like a bit of a chore as well, folks. If you've just got one tank to do, it's not so bad. But there's days where, for instance, as a commission painter, I might be carrying out this process across 20 tanks. It is time consuming. It can take maybe 15 minutes to do a tank, but the result compared to just washing the entire vehicle and then removing somehow by whatever technique the excess wash, the results are so much brighter, which then allows us to create much more contrast at the stage where we're highlighting, which therefore improves the overall shape and depth of the details on the completed vehicle. So bearing in mind our desire not to get too dark a finish, we have to remember that there's Zimmerit here and it's going to need a wash. So I'm going to get the paint very thin here, folks, for these Zimmerited surfaces, and make sure that it's just enough to shade and not too much, not over the top. Zimmerit can really be a challenge, but if we get this right, as you see when it comes to the highlighting process, it is possible to bring that Zimmerit out and not darken down the finished result too much. You can get a good look at that here on the turret, folks. See me drawing off the excess. Thankfully there is not as much work to do in shading the Opel Blitz. Most of the work is actually on the bonnet and around the engine vents and so on, because there's lots of little panel lines there. And then you've just got panel lines on the planking on the rear of the truck. Not much to it, folks. One last wash to apply, folks, and that's going to be a very mucky enamel wash that I'm going to apply to the wheels, not to the tracks. You could apply it to the tracks, but the tracks have already got the look that I am after. I don't need to do any more weathering to it. So this is very, very messy, folks. I'm going to apply a nice thick wash and then draw off the excess with some thinner. And then when I've done both sides, I'm then going to lie it flat on its side rather than on its bottom. That way the paint will sink down into the recesses and dry nice and even without drawing itself to the bottom of the wheel. One more thing I'm going to do at this point on the Zimmerit is paint the exposed red primer where the Zimmerit has been removed in patches from the hull. Nice bit of damage, nice bit of battle damage. Now I'm using very bright red here, folks. I want it to look different from the brown on the camel, but don't worry, it's going to get weathered down, so it's not going to look so bright and stark. Now we can move on to the highlighting, which will naturally then lead us on to the chipping. Now this is another time consuming process when you work it out tank by tank. You probably talk about another 15 minutes for a complicated tank such as a Panther, but it will allow us to control the highlight and place it as much as possible directly beside the shade for the greatest possible contrast and depth. I begin the highlighting process by working on exposed edges, exterior edges or easy to reach edges of panels. Now I'm using Iraqi sand for this. You can use maybe a softer highlight colour, but Iraqi sand really helps it stand out and allow you to see the highlighting quite clearly. Now I'm not going to be highlighting the complete edges all the way along, then it just looks too blocky and square and not so natural. We can get a highlighted edge by bouncing the brush along the edge. You don't have to draw it straight along. And the kind of brush I'm using for this is one which is going to be suitable for to use the flat of the brush, if you understand. And it's not one that I would use for any more detailed work, because this kind of edge highlighting can wear out brushes quite quick in my experience. Next up, using a brush with a good point on it, I am going to highlight all the little raised areas, you know, little clips on the side skirts, hatch handles, and all these kind of details. And also I'm going to use that brush to reach areas where the edging approach isn't suitable, you know, the really fine panel lines and such likes. And once again, when I'm doing this, folks, except on the really small areas, I'm not necessarily looking for a solid line of highlight. Some areas it may be more appropriate, such as on recessed hatches and such likes, but just be careful that you're not like giving everything a neon bright edge. I use the highlighting process as the starting point for the chipping process. So for instance, I may highlight particular corners of panels, such as on the side skirts, more heavily on some than on others, and likewise around corners of hatches and so on. So when we go on to chipping, we have somewhere to start our focus. Now highlighting the Zimmerit, folks. That's something where you might think a dry brush would be ideal, but it's not, in my opinion, going to get you the best contrast and the best depth. It's just going to get you a dusty overall look, and it's going to sink the camel right back into the base colour. So what I do is, and it might look a little bit crazy, but it actually doesn't take very much time at all because we're working on a small area, is I highlight the Zimmerit by hand using the Iraqi sand, but I only do it where the dark yellow is exposed. And what that does is it brightens up the surface, but then sinks the the darker camel blotches back a little bit, which then actually makes them stand out a bit more because you've got your contrast, you've got your dark and your light. And as I said, it doesn't actually take that long to do it because there is not that much exposed dark yellow on the overall vehicle. So this controlled highlighting with the controlled wash that we applied earlier helps bring that Zimmerit detail out. Next up, using a very fine brush, we're going to do the chipping. Now the purpose of the chipping is first of all to give it a little bit more visual appeal, a little bit of weathered look, but also to help break up panels, especially larger panels, so that they have a little bit more focus and it actually helps bring the whole kit together. I'm using Iraqi sand again, but then I will also be using German Camel Black Brown because I'll be painting the chips and the lines to represent exposed base colour paint, a lighter paint because it's not weathered down, and then as you'll see the German Camel Black Brown will get painted into the core of these chips. Some of them I'll just leave as the Iraqi sand, but others will get a German Camel Black Brown core which represents exposed metal that has started to rust. Now it's very easy to go over the top with the chipping process, folks. You're having fun, you're exploring the process and getting used to the technique, but then you're probably going to end up with something that looks as though it's been dragged out of a scrap heap. So remember what we're doing here, folks. We're just trying to give it a little bit of visual appeal and a bit of focus to the larger panels to help draw the whole thing together, unify the surface. It's not about making the thing look like a wreck. Now, being a German tank, this is of course absolutely covered in tools and cables and all kind of things, so there's a bit of detail to be done here. I'm not going to go into it in a great deal of detail myself. You just have to paint accurately and with the following colours and you should get a good result. The metallic items such as the machine gun, the tools, the cable and such likes, I start with a coat of German grey. That's going to be the shade colour. Now for some of the tools I will then apply a coat of dark grey, leaving some of that German grey as the shade. In other areas I will simply go straight to a highlight of London grey. So they are basically all the same but a little bit different, and that just helps distinguish all the components where they are close together. For wooden handles I have a shade colour of Flat Earth and then a main colour of New Wood. Nice and simple. Now you should note that the handles on the wire cutters are not made of wood, they are made of compressed paper or Bakelite, so I go for a darker colour for them, typically German Camel Medium Brown. It's certainly worthwhile taking a bit of time to paint this in accurately, make it stand out from the hull, because it's going to add a lot of character to the finished result on what is a very characterful kit. Now let's add some rust, but that's something that should be controlled. Remember, this is not a wreck, so I'm only going to be adding rust to spare tracks and to the exhausts. So with a base coat, which is going to be a shade colour of dark rust, I'm going to add a very rough coat using a fairly rough brush of the light rust, and then a final highlight, very very small highlight of yellowish rust, just to help make that area pop just a little bit of extra brightness. The discarded shell casings on the rear deck are an interesting feature of this sculpt. Now you could just use a metallic brass colour for this, but I prefer non-metallic approaches as much as possible. So what I've done here is I've given them a starting coat of green brown, then that's the shade colour. The main colour then is Japanese uniform with a highlight of green ochre, and then I add a little bit of German Camel Black Brown into the open ends of the shell casings, just to give them a little bit of depth and detail, and it just helps define the shape. one final detail on the hull is to darken down that red primer that's been exposed through the damaged Zimmerit. So just using the acrylic wash that we used before, just apply as much as it takes to get it down to a dark enough level for you, but still with that red appearance so that it stands out against the brown of the camel blotches. Now, one of the most distinctive parts of this kit, which is an individually sculpted resin kit, is the turret. Now you get the commander sculpted in the cupola, that's in metal, and then a little crewman peeking out the rear hatch, which is just part of the resin kit. So I'll quickly go over how I paint German tank crew, which is really quite a simple process as well, folks, because they're basically black. So I start by giving the uniform itself an undercoat of black. That's going to be our shade colour. The hands and face and parts of the cap are going to be German camel black brown as a shade colour. So I then add a layer of German grey onto the raised areas of the uniform. I'm not trying to paint the whole thing grey, I'm just hitting the raised areas, so there's quite a lot of black left there. You know, it's a very strong shade. And then I'm going to highlight the German grey with very, very small lines of London grey. This is a very strong highlight that is there to help create the shape and the depth that we need in such a dark figure. But if you use too much, it's just going to look completely out of scale and it will just confuse the eye. Now the cap or field cap, other than the black areas, are going to be my standard German field grey kind of colours, which is dark mud highlighted by green grey. Nothing too complicated here, folks. It's a very small part of the visible figure. The fine detailing of the uniform, well, that's something that will to a large extent depend on the detail that's in the sculpt, or that you yourself are prepared to paint into the sculpt. So what I typically do is on the cap use deck tan for the eagle, the little circle badge on the front of the cap. I just use red for the Waffenfarbe. Nothing more exciting than that. You don't really see much more on them, folks. They're really usually small on Tank Commander figures. Now for the headphones, the throat mic and all the cabling that goes with it, I actually go for a pretty inaccurate, unhistorical colour, folks, but I want to be able to see it. If it was historically accurate, it would just be, well, grey and disappear against the uniform. So what I do is I use old wood with a very, very fine highlight of Iraqi sand, and then that just makes it pop. It means I can see it. I'm happy I can see it. If it was accurate, I wouldn't be able to see it, but you might be more happy with that, folks, so just make your own choice. For the skin, it's my usual recipe, which is saddle brown, the next layer being bronze skin tone, that's a game colour bronze skin tone, and then flat flesh for some tiny little highlights. I'm now going to do a little bit of streaking on the tank. It's really just going to be on the side skirts and the angled upper surface of the turret, because the rest of it is Zimmerit. Zimmerit, it doesn't streak in the way that a smooth-sided slab of metal will do. Zimmerit just gathers dust, so it's just going to be on these areas. I'm going to take the same wash that we used in the pin wash and add little dots along the top surface of the panels that I'm working on. Then taking a brush which is only just damp. If it's wet, it's just going to ruin the effect altogether. It will just spread everywhere. So only just damp. I'm going to catch those dots and draw them down in a way that it makes sense in terms of gravity flow. You know, the streaks are going to flow down as you would expect them to from top to bottom. I will work the wash up and down. I might switch to a different size brush for a more refined effect, and I'll just keep going until I'm happy with the finished look. Take some off perhaps, add some more on if that's required. You do have quite a bit of time to work with this particular acrylic wash, but just like all weathering stages, folks, don't overdo it. I'm going to show you the decals here, folks. It's quite a generic process that is got very, very common approaches from all modelers really, but I'll take a moment to go through what I'm doing. So I'm starting off with the setter fluid here, applying that to where I'm going to put the decals. I should point out that I've also applied a very thin coat of gloss, even though this has already been gloss varnished. Apply a very thin coat of gloss to the area where I'm going to add the decals, just to make sure I've got a really smooth surface. It also helps to seal any weathering that's been applied after the gloss varnish has been applied. You don't want that to start moving or lifting when we are using the Decal Fix solutions. When I'm working with a smooth surface, I find that for most decals the setter solution is all I'm going to need. That'll fix it in place. I push it down carefully with a cotton bud, careful not to lift or change the position of the decal when I'm doing it. And then if there's no silvering, I'm quite happy, I can leave it at that. By silvering, I don't mean does it look glossy, I mean does it look semi-opaque in certain areas. That way we know it's not actually fully in contact with the surface, and some softening may be required. When you're using the softener, you've got to be careful because not all decals are the same. Some are thicker, some are thinner, some are stronger, some are softer. So little steps is what's required here, folks, if you're not familiar with the decal set. So I let the decal softener sit just for a few minutes, and then I go back and start trying to work it into the surface. As you can see, I'm using a cotton bud for this. That has a bit of give in it, so that you can push it into the surface of the Zimmerit. It can sometimes shed little hairs, little threads of cotton, but I usually pick that up later when I'm applying some matte varnish over the top. But you can also intercept that early doors just by applying a wet brush over the top of the dried decal. That will pick up any hairs that I've attached. I then set it aside for a few minutes to take another look at it, and in most cases I'll have to go back to do a little bit of work. There's always going to be one area which isn't quite right. So this is why you need to be careful and not overdo it, because if you overdo it you may find the decal starts to fall to bits. So don't work with it too wet, give it a chance to dry between applications. And once it's dry, I give a very careful coat of matte varnish to the areas where the decals are and the gloss paint that is surrounding those decals. Remember, we applied that manually too. The workshop can be a great objective marker in version 4, folks, if you're not using this as a warrior team in version 3. It's a great piece to have in your collection, if nothing else. So it's very detailed, there's a lot of things sculpted into it. So the most important approach from my point of view for this is making all those different elements stand out against each other, but still come all together in one piece. I've done some undercoating already here, folks, with shade colours, that I'm going to be using on the various areas. So at the moment it's pretty much just looking like one colour all over, but we're going to build up on that. So I'm starting with the tarpaulin cover. It's the biggest single element, and I've got a coat of olive drab in there to start, and then I'm going to layer up through dark mud and then a highlight of green grey. So it's pretty much a German grey uniform kind of colour. You can use many similar kind of colours, folks, but this is what I'm going to use for this particular piece. Now I've taken a couple of passes across this, folks, to get to this stage you can see here, and I am, as you can see, just painting these lines across the body of the tarp, where you can imagine the lines to be for a tarpaulin stretched over a metal frame, or where in some cases, particularly around the corners of the frame, where the tarpaulin is sagging, the sculpt will help guide us there. And we're just building up the shape, building up the lines, working in semi-opaque layers basically, and as we thicken up the layers we will get a nice soft transition between the recessed and the raised areas on the tarpaulin. And then for the highlight, some very small lines of green grey. And this is how we're going to create the depth on what is basically a quite flat area of the resin. There's not a lot of sculpted depth to it, but we're going to create that by applying the thin highlights beside the shade colour, and that creates contrast and depth. But keep these highlight lines nice and small and thin. The tarpaulin stretched over the cab, I've given a shade colour of US Field Drab, and then I'm going to use old wood and then highlight of Iraqi sand to layer that up. Now the good thing for us here is that there's a lot of detail sculpted into that because it's stretched taut over the frame of the cab, so there's lots of recessed areas and raised areas to guide us. I'm using the same colour on the sheet or tarpaulin that is covering the table there. And remember folks, it may well take you 2 coats to get the right coverage, to get the right opacity. Don't try to put it on too thick, you know, take your time. 2 coats is better than 1 ugly coat. To make this small tarpaulin or sheet stand out, I've used green grey with a highlight of Splinter Camo base. It'll really help make it pop out and not get lost in the background of the rest of the objective marker. The various little wooden items scattered around, like the stools or the tabletop, I have layered up from German Camo black brownish shade with the main colour of German Camo medium brown, and then little highlights of new wood. It's at this point folks that I realised I should have painted the tyres already, but never mind, I'll just get in carefully behind the areas I've already painted, and I'm just going to use dark rubber for this. Nothing very complicated here folks, we're just going to get a coat of dark rubber on and later on we'll weather it down. The crates that are lying on the ground and around the vehicle I'm layering up from German Camo black brown through medium grey to deck tan. Now that's quite a lot of contrast, but that helps get a lot of shape in a very small object, and the lighter colour, the washed out bleached kind of look, will help once again to make it stand out strongly against the background of the overall piece. The jerry cans have been given a shade layer of dark yellow and then a main layer of Middlestone, and then for highlight you can use German Camo beige, or if you're looking for something a bit more sharper and bright looking, you can use deck tan. There are several oil drums scattered around the workshop. Some are holding up the table, some are just lying around the vehicle, so what I'm going to do is give them all a coat of German grey as a shade colour, and then some of them I will use Luftwaffe uniform, it's a nice bluey grey, and other ones I'm going to use London grey, and I can use a London grey as a highlight on the Luftwaffe uniform and deck tan as a highlight on the London grey, and then we'll get some sort of greyish metallic kind of cans that are going to be distinctive against the rest of the objective but not too bright. In the open rear of the Opel Blitz, after painting in a bit of detail, after also painting in some sort of representations of the panelling on the inside because it's not sculpted on the inside, I'm just applying a little wash of the acrylic dark brown wash here just to darken things down a little. I'm now going to add some pigments to the ground itself. Now the ground colour is Panzer Ace's German Tank Crew highlight. So German Tank Crew is black, this highlight is really quite brown, though it really works quite well as a highlight for black in certain circumstances. I find it's a great colour for earth, you know, on my bases. If I'm going to paint my bases earth colour and not use a filler, this is the colour I'm going to use. Then I'm using a light mud coloured pigment powder to very softly, not too heavily, go over the surface so that we're giving it a little bit more depth. Using a dark pigment colour, I'm going to put a wash over the wheels, the wheel arches, and all the under areas of the truck. You'll notice that I've painted the flat open areas with the earth colour so that you don't have dark yellow going all the way down to the ground, and I'm just going to darken that down so it becomes more shade like and disappears more into the background. Now the engine block that's sitting there waiting to get hit by a big mallet, that I'm just painting in various shades of grey, building up from German grey through, for instance, the Luftwaffe uniform grey, dark grey, London grey, just building it up. So we've got various greys to help separate all the different components that make up the overall engine block. Then it's an overall wash, a dark wash, just to tie everything together and dirty it down. A brown wash might also have worked quite well for this, folks, you know, for like spilt oil and accumulated dirt. And when that wash is dry, just a few highlights here and there, folks, just to help the various components pop out. Just choose something appropriate and something that's going to not be overly bright for the greys that you're working on. London grey in controlled amounts will probably do well over all the various surfaces here. And after this, folks, it was just left for me to glue on the mechanic with his big mallet and put some flock down and some tufts. And that's us done, folks. Hopefully it was an interesting subject for you. I like this particular set. It's a pity you can't get it anymore. I have one set aside in my stash, but this one I painted for a client, and I'm very busy with commissions, so when will I get round to painting my own Barkmann? Well, who knows. But folks, if you want to keep me busy, get in touch about commissions. The email address will be coming up on screen just now, and let me know what kind of projects you might be interested in. So that's us done for just now. So thanks for watching, as always. Thanks to the subscribers and to the folk who just pop in from time to time to see what's happening on the channel. If you'd like to subscribe, hit the button and hit the bell button, and that'll help me build up the channel and bring this kind of content to more people who like it, and also means I'll definitely see you all on the next one.